It's always funny to me when making videos like this and lists like these. I feel like a lot of times you're going to inevitably miss some games, probably because you just didn't play them in the moment. So you didn't have the ability to include them because you hadn't played them yet. And recently I played through a game from 2023 that I didn't talk about in my 2023 video that I just wanted to shout out real quick because it would have made my cream before the crop list in that video. Thanks to Xbox Game Pass, I was finally able to recently play Have a Nice Death, which is a game that's really fun. I don't know what it is, but I've become a little more interested in roguelites recently, and this one was really easy to get addicted to. Really fun 2D platformer mix with some really cool combat, and I finally got to complete a run in it recently, and honestly, when it comes to roguelites, that's all I need. I know a lot of times you gotta beat it multiple times to, complete the game, but one run's good enough for me. I wanted to mention that because in the descriptions of these videos, I include my Backloggd, so you can see what I'm playing, and some people might look at my Backloggd and say, oh, you gave Have a Nice Death a really high score, but didn't talk about it in your 2023 video, because I hadn't played it when I filmed the video. And now I have, so just shouting it out, and just want to say if you haven't played it yet, give it a try. That is my recommendation of the intro that I'm gonna do, and I feel like some of you might be like, why are you starting the video with that? Well, it's better than starting the video with my opinion on Hellblade 2 since I just beat that recently. Let's not talk about it. Let's talk about the actual topic of this video. Welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And it's the next entry in the series within a series, so as you can tell from the title, today I want to talk about my favorite games of 2005. You probably know the format by this point. I get into an intro where I talk about what the year looked like, what the climate of gaming looked like, how the big console publishers were doing. I talk about some big games that I didn't get to play or that I don't have a strong enough opinion on. I talk about the games that just missed the cut of my two main lists. So the games that, like, on a 1 to 10 scale, I'd probably give a 7 to. The cream before the crop, which is the games that I gave an 8 or 9 out of 10 to that I really enjoyed. They might not be my favorites of all time, but I still enjoyed them. And then my proper best list, the games that I would personally give a 10 out of 10 to. And this video is actually the last time in this series where there will only be one game that got a 10 out of 10. There will be one other time where 0 games got a 10 out of 10 in a given year, but this is the last time that the best list will just be a best game. Just wanted to get that out of the way, because I know sometimes it could be weird when it's like, time for the best list, here's one game. So this is the last time that's happening. Anyway, on to the actual topic of the video itself, on to 2005 as a year in gaming, and before I start, I have one thing that I need to quickly say. Woo! 2005, the year of the gamer! Woo! Is Penny Arcade still popular? I hope so. I see them all the time on TV tropes, and I think they're really funny. But yes, 2005, a year in gaming that, despite me just mentioning, only had one personal 10 out of 10 game, was a year with a lot of really exciting games. I know I mentioned in the last video that people see 2004 as one of the best years in gaming, but 2005 was certainly no slouch either. A lot of great games between things I did and did not play, a lot of very significant games as well, and a lot of exciting things going on for pretty much every big console manufacturer. On the Sony front, the PlayStation 2 became the fastest console to pass 100 million units, and while that record would inevitably be surpassed by the Nintendo DS, it was still a pretty huge deal. Obviously, this thing is, as of right now, as of the time that this video is going up, the highest selling console of all time. It was a pretty huge deal. This thing obviously sold incredibly well, and in 2005, it continued to sell incredibly well. Sales were actually a touch higher than they were in 2004. People were still buying PS2s in droves, this despite the fact that 2005 was the year that the PS3 was formally announced. And yes, many of you probably already know about it, but the PS3's controller originally did look like that. It did quite literally look like a Frisbee. I'm very glad that it didn't end up being the final controller for the PS3. And I alluded to this in the last video, but 2005 was a pretty big year because here in America at least, 2005 saw the release of Sony's first portable platform, the PlayStation Portable, or as we all kind of call it, just the PSP. This thing was a pretty big deal at the time, and it rode in on a massive wave of hype. Matter of fact, I spent a lot of the last video talking about the Nintendo DS, and I will talk a little bit about it in this video, of course, but at the time, I think people were actually expecting that the PSP was going to curb stomp the DS, especially with the DS being a gimmicky platform with 2 screens and a touchscreen. The PSP was pretty ambitious at the time because it was kind of meant to be a console on the go. These days, when you think of handheld gaming, you think of more bite-sized experiences that aren't as big or as lavish as a console experience. Same goes for a mobile game. Obviously, the mobile market really spawned from the handheld market, but PlayStation wanted to bring handheld gaming out of that, and they wanted to make a handheld that essentially had the quality and the production values of a console. In a lot of ways, the PSP was almost like a PlayStation 2 on the go. In a big way, that did kind of feel like a misreading of what a handheld game is supposed to be. It seemed like they were basically a solution looking for a problem by basically being like, oh yeah, handheld games need to be more extravagant, they need to be more high production value, all that crap, when really they didn't need to. But it made this a very interesting product, and in a lot of ways, people still look back on it very fondly because it kind of was the Switch before the Switch. Nowadays, the Switch, you can play it as a console and as a handheld, and you can play these console-quality games in handheld form, and the PSP was kind of a precursor to that. It also has some popularity because it was very easy to homebrew this thing and to add your own custom firmware to it. And I know people that had full-blown emulators on a PSP that could play PS1 games, NES games, SNES games, N64 games. Like, you could go ham in terms of just making your PSP a hack and homebrew machine of some kind. And while it did not curb stomp the Nintendo DS, in fact it did not sell anywhere near as much, of course, it actually can at least hold its head up and say that it's maybe the only handheld to actually go against a Nintendo handheld and walk away without being destroyed. Like, yeah, of course the DS won the battle, but the PSP can actually say that it kind of put up a fight, and that it was one of the few non-Nintendo handhelds to actually become quite a success. Even if it didn't fully accomplish Sony's goal of convincing people, yeah, console games need to be on handhelds. But at least it established that goal a little better than another Sony portable that we will talk about later on. But speaking of Nintendo, the GameCube sales, even though 2005 was a year where there were some decent games on the GameCube, the numbers continued to drop a little bit. It was still becoming very hard to convince people to want to buy a GameCube, especially because third parties were really jumping ship on the GameCube by this point. A lot of the hardcore third-party games that were coming out in 2005 were not coming to the GameCube. Or they were also coming to the PS2 where they were going to sell a lot better. It might also help that 2005 was the year where Nintendo formally unveiled the Revolution in probably one of the coolest console intros ever, where the late Satoru Iwata, may he rest in peace, was out on the E3 stage and he just pulled the thing out of his jacket and held it up in the air. That was honestly pretty damn cool. But either way, I think that kind of cut into the GameCube sales because when it came to Nintendo, many people were probably just getting ready for the next generation. Though even with the GameCube not doing so well, the DS was absolutely killing it. I mentioned in the last video that this thing became a huge piece as far as sales were concerned, and it saw a massive jump in sales in 2005, and that's largely because it was finally getting some really big games. At launch, you had like Super Mario 64 DS and a couple other third-party throwaways, but by 2005, some of the first-party games were really coming along, and there were some huge ones. It also helps that 2005 was the year where Nintendo introduced its first online service with Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, and yeah, I know we could talk about Nintendo's online for years and talk about how rough it is, but at the time, it was pretty cool to see Nintendo kind of leap into the world of online gaming. And as we will get into at least a little bit in this video, it helps that some of the early online games that were coming to the DS were some pretty huge ones. Like some massive, massive games that would go on to define the Nintendo DS as a platform. And when it comes to Microsoft, the OG Xbox sales did tail off just a touch, but that's because, largely because I'd say, 2005 was the year where the Xbox 360 released. This was the first console of the 7th generation, and it basically got a jump start on the 7th generation, and it was arguably, I would say, maybe even unarguably, the system where Xbox finally started to come into its own as a genuine PlayStation competitor. The original Xbox really lagged behind the PS2, but the 360, for a long portion of its life, was actually ahead of the PS3. And we'll get into that later, of course. But yeah, this thing was a pretty huge deal, and I'm sure a lot of you guys watching are really excited to see, oh my god, the Xbox 360. It was a pretty powerful console, and with the PlayStation 3 eventually being a pain in the ass to develop for, and we'll get into that in the next video, Xbox was able to secure more exclusives on the 360, and it was able to gain some franchises that were once synonymous with PlayStation. It was even able to secure some big Japanese franchises, which is wild to think about because the Xbox has never been successful in Japan, and this was no different, but it was still a huge success. And one big thing that really helped the 360 become a success was that Xbox Live was even bigger on this thing than it was on the OG Xbox, and this was the console that really brought online gaming in vogue. There were so many great community options and such a large number of players that pretty much made this a great place for gamers to play, especially online. It is wild to think that it became such a success though, because early in its life there were some huge shipment issues. Apparently Xbox started producing the console 69 days before launch. 69, nice. And the thing did have some big hardware problems. Hello, Red Ring of Death. But even despite that, the 360 became a huge success, by far Xbox's biggest success, and for a solid portion of time, like I said, it was even beating out PlayStation in terms of market share. That seems a little wild to think about now because Xbox is, well, Xbox, but yes, the 360 was a genuine success story for them. And after the OG Xbox pretty much never turned a profit, this was the console that actually turned the corner into profitability for Xbox, which was pretty impressive. Once again though, we're probably not going to be talking about many Xbox 360 games in this video just because there weren't really a ton of huge ones at launch. I mean, the biggest first-party games for the 360 at launch were Cameo Elements of Power and Perfect Dark Zero, and I don't really have much to say about either game. Don't worry, in due time we'll talk about plenty of games that were on the 360. And as far as notable third-party news, because sometimes I will talk about that, 2005 was also the year of the formation of Bandai Namco, which was actually a pretty massive surprise at the time, especially because while Bandai had video games, they were more known for being in other entertainment and media markets than Namco was. It's said that the merger came because of advances in technology at the time, and I had to learn this through this video and this research, but Japan's declining birth rates. It turns out in Japan there's far less incentive to get married and have kids for a variety of reasons, and Bandai Namco felt that, along with a desire to stay relevant with younger audiences, was important. And obviously we now know Bandai Namco as one of the biggest third-party publishers in the game and one of the biggest Japanese publishers in the game, so clearly this surprise move actually worked out incredibly. One thing that may not have worked out so incredibly, that was a pretty big deal in 2005 in the news, before I talk about it, when you guys wake up in the morning, does anyone enjoy a good hot coffee? I know, that was a terrible transition, but yes, hot coffee happened in 2005. You know how hard it was to find a picture to put here that wouldn't get me copyright struck or flagged or anything like that? But yes, hot coffee, the big mod from Grand Theft Auto San Andreas that was a sex minigame essentially. This was not the first time there had been government intervention in gaming. I mean, look at the formation of the ESRB as a whole. But this was one of the first big examples, because I guess it was a pretty huge deal at the time to see a sex minigame that was as explicit as this in a video game, even if it wasn't in the proper release. Especially because at the time, people had wanted Grand Theft Auto San Andreas to get an adults-only rating because they didn't want anyone younger than 21 to be able to play it. And this fiasco actually led to harsher restrictions by the ESRB. In the past, it seemed like they would just rate games based on some video demonstrations, but now they had to start rating games based on the entirety of what they offered. I think that was a big deal when an Elder Scrolls game had to have its rating changed from T to M. And I think this shows more than that 2005 saw gaming in a much bigger place because now gaming was big enough to have controversies. Who would have ever thought? But anyway, I think I've gone on with the intro long enough that now we can talk about the actual games themselves. And like I said, there were some big games in 2005 that I either didn't play or just didn't play enough of and didn't beat, so I won't be talking about them in this video, but I will shout them out. These first two games are games that I eventually beat in their remade form, just not in the original form. Resident Evil 4, I just couldn't get accustomed to the tank controls in the original game, but I was able to beat it, obviously, with the remake. Talked about that in my 2023 video. I love RE4 Remake. There was also Shadow of the Colossus, which I will talk about in my 2018 video. I never played the original version, but I did play the remade version. Some pretty massive DS games from 2005 as well, like Nintendogs, which was a prime you had to be there moment in gaming. I have a lot of memories with Nintendogs, but I didn't play enough of it that I feel like I could give a rating, especially because it's been way too long since I've played Nintendogs. There was also Animal Crossing Wild World, which again was a big game for Nintendo's Wi-Fi, and the game that really brought Animal Crossing into a much bigger light than it already had been. Again, I just have never really played an Animal Crossing game other than like City Folk on the Wii. There was also Mario Kart DS, which was huge for the Wi-Fi service, and it was another hugely popular Mario Kart game. But this is probably one of the ones I've played the least, so I can't really talk about it super deep. I'll also mention this game because I will talk about this franchise much more in the future, but Guitar Hero was 2005, and a lot of people who know me know that I went through a huge Guitar Hero phase at one point, and it's been one of my favorite franchises. I have caused myself much hand pain playing Guitar Hero. However, I didn't play Guitar Hero 1 as much, and what little I did play of it, I didn't enjoy quite as much as the other games because the hammer-ons and the pull-offs were just like so impossible that you basically just had to strum them. But it was a very huge game for 2005 that started a franchise that would, for a good portion of the late 2000s, become one of the biggest in gaming. So I had to at least shout it out, especially because I love the franchise and I will wax poetic about it as we move on to the next few videos. But we're not there yet, we're here, so let's talk about some more games from 2005, some games that just missed the cut. Games that I enjoyed enough to give like a 7 out of 10 to, but they're not going to make either of my lists for the given year. I've got 3 games here, the first one being Star Wars Republic Commando. I don't think I've talked about a Star Wars game yet in this series, believe it or not, but I just recently played this game again for May the 4th. I am not a Star Wars fan by any means, but I do enjoy some Star Wars video games. Oh right, I did mention it in my one video when I talked about KOTOR that I wear a Star Wars watch, so I'm kind of a poser. But yes, Republic Commando was a very interesting and different kind of shooter with a unique tactical twist. Even though there were a lot of points for me where the game just kind of felt like a Halo clone, it's still a pretty good game, and it is available on modern platforms, so if you want to try it out, you have an opportunity to. There was also Tony Hawk's Underground 2 Remix, which was really impressive for the time as a game that I couldn't believe they were able to squish onto a PSP. This was also a PSP game that I played the most when I was younger. Even though, yeah, it obviously had some concessions because it was on a handheld, it's still a pretty fun game. And then the last just missed the cut game was Kirby Canvas Curse, one of my very first DS games, and a great showcase of the DS's touchscreen at the time, even though there were times where it couldn't help but feel like the early DS game that it was. Still pretty fun, and if you can find it, I would still recommend giving it a shot. But now let's talk about the games that I really enjoyed in 2005. The cream before the crop. My 8 and 9 out of 10 games. I don't even know how many I have here, but I know I have quite a few, and this video has already gone on quite a bit, so let's just jump right in. Even as someone who enjoyed Devil May Cry 2 a bit more than most, Devil May Cry 3 Dante's Awakening was much needed for this franchise. Compared to the first 2 Devil May Cry games, this was an even smoother game with much more fulfilling combat than before, and an even more gratifying and rewarding combo system as well. The action set pieces are still incredible, and the new character customization variety is an excellent addition that brings even more greatness to what is already a very great game. I also know a lot of people talk about how this game can be incredibly challenging, so I'm extra glad that there is an easy mode as well. As someone who prefers to play my games on lower difficulties, I'm greatly appreciative of that. I feel like this was the game where Devil May Cry was really starting to come into its own, and this game showed exactly what it takes to bounce back from a polarizing entry in a franchise. It takes the spirit of what made the series great, polishes it up, and makes smart tweaks to keep things fresh. Even now, with several games since, it's still a huge high point in the series, one of my personal favorites, and it's another great entry in a series that would continue to excel from here. It shouldn't be surprising to see me add a game like this here, especially after I talked about Donkey Konga in the last video, but to this day, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat remains one of the most unique and interesting platformers that I have played. A 2D platformer where you control Donkey Kong using a pair of bongos. It shouldn't work, but it absolutely works, and only Nintendo can say that. Oddly enough, as weird as it sounds, I think the bongos actually enhance the experience. Even though I will warn, I replayed the game a few months back, and it did kind of hurt my hands playing it with the bongos. I do recommend some gloves or something of that nature. But the rest of the game is still awesome. I love the level design and the very lively visuals, and the combo system added a little extra spunk to the game as well. It was always satisfying when you were collecting beats in the game, and because you had such a high combo, you went through and were like, oh, I just collected 400 beats at once. And it's also really cool to look back on a game like this and see how it would inspire another game that the developer of this one worked on, that being Super Mario Galaxy. And obviously, don't you worry, we will talk about that game later. But yeah, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat is a fantastic game and another hallmark of Nintendo's ability to take a strange concept that shouldn't work and make it absolutely incredible. As we move through this series, you're gonna see that I hold some pretty unpopular takes on the God of War franchise, and that it's not a franchise that I personally love as much as everyone else does, though I can at least say that most of the games are at the very least good, and the original God of War remains pretty compelling. It's got a lot of epic action set pieces and some really tight combat, with some pretty unique puzzles to it as well. And I also love the epic scale of the boss fights. That's something I think the series has always excelled with, making these incredible, awesome, large-scale boss fights, and I think the later entries would succeed in a much greater degree in that regard as well. But it's cool I can even say something that complimentary about the first game, that even the first game's boss fights were super epic in scale. Yes, there are some elements in the game that I feel have aged a little poorly, like the fixed camera being a real pain in the ass, but this is still a strong first entry in what will become one of Sony's biggest and most important franchises. Of course, I will give you plenty of time throughout the series to hate me for my other unpopular opinions that I have, but we'll wait until the time is right for that. This was a game that took me a minute to come around to. I first tried Psychonauts back in 2018 with the PS4 re-release that had come out, but I really struggled to get into it. I would later go on to hear that the PS4 port is one of the worst ways to play the game, and eventually after subscribing to Xbox Game Pass, I decided to give it another chance with the OG Xbox version that I heard was much better, complete with some potential Xbox Series X bells and whistles. And I'm really glad I did, because Psychonauts became a game I greatly enjoyed. It's a very quirky platformer that's absolutely out there in pretty much every way possible constantly, but it's also extremely compelling. It might take you a minute to find your land legs with some of the puzzles, but once you do, the game becomes a bundle of oddball fun. There's some strange but nonetheless excellent humor and some very unique gameplay ideas here as well. The level design and platforming is super smooth, and I think the addition of psychic powers gives the gameplay a bit of added flair too. This is a really fun game that I'm glad to see has maintained a strong cult following, and honestly, damn, I really gotta replay the Psychonauts games again soon. They're really awesome. Hey, would you believe it? I'm actually talking about a mainline Pokemon game in this series. And it's the last time I'm gonna do it until the final video where I talk about 2022. Sorry. But yes, as I'm not the biggest lover of turn-based RPGs, the Pokemon franchise was always one I would play for a little bit and then drop, never really seeing them through until the end. With that said, there is one game in the series that I did play and beat until recently, of course, with Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet, but Pokemon Emerald was the other game that I actually played through fully, and Gen 3 was always my favorite Pokemon gen. It kind of helps that it's the one that I grew up with, and Pokemon Emerald remains my favorite Pokemon game. I love that this game brought double battles to the table. I thought that was a cool, interesting piece of new strategy for the series. A lot of the Pokemon in Gen 3 are among some of my personal favorites, and I think Hoenn is such a vibrant and beautiful region, brought to life by some incredibly vibrant and colorful visuals too. And I know I don't talk as much about video game music in these videos, but the music in this game, whoo, baby! I mean, Pokemon generally has some great music. Obviously, a lot of Nintendo games have great music, but this game has some of my personal favorite video game music maybe ever. Point blank, period. Last year was the year that I finally played through and beat this fully, and doing so was such a treat. It's the kind of game that just puts a massive smile on my face. I'm glad some of the newer games have made things a touch more accessible for a pea-brain newbie like me that's not good with type advantages and disadvantages. I know, you can make fun of me if you want. But when it comes to Pokemon, I'll always have a soft spot for Hoenn. And even though I never really beat the games, I'll also have a soft spot for Sinnoh, because I played a lot of those growing up. But either way, yes, Gen 3, still my favorite Pokemon gen. This might be one of the last times I combine multiple games into one, just because they're kinda able to be talked about together. But yes, I talked about Donkey Konga in my last video because that game has had a huge impact on me, and Donkey Konga 2 was a game I actually thought was even better than the first one. The gameplay grind to unlock songs on the higher difficulties was nowhere near as bad as the last game, and it felt like there was some great new content here, like the new minigames, which I actually enjoyed more than the first games. I'll also point out that while Donkey Konga 2 being a T-rated game and having a track list that featured songs from artists like Good Charlotte, Usher, Pink, Amerie, Incubus, and REM, might make you think, what do you mean this game wasn't made on drugs? I think the setlist was pretty freaking awesome. Hell, it might honestly blow your mind, but it's kind of wild to say this out loud. Good Charlotte was in the fucking commercial for this game. Yeah, I know. Actually, in a lot of ways, I feel like I have to thank Donkey Konga 2 for kind of influencing my music taste in my youth and even now. Quite frankly, I kind of look back at this game and I go, huh, maybe that's why I'm such a big lover of R&B music, because it had so many awesome R&B hits. Donkey Konga 2 is still my favorite in the series, though Donkey Konga 3 is pretty good too. As a kid, I'd always wanted to play this game, but I was never able to because obviously it never got localized. I had heard about the game through game trailers, remember them? And I was always like, when's it coming to America? But then it never did. But I finally got to play it through my teenage and adult years thanks to completely legal methods. Don't look at me like that. I do enjoy it, even though I do think it made the coin grind a little bit worse compared to 2's. I also don't understand how the banana tree minigame worked, though it helps that obviously I had to play the game in its original language, and I don't speak Japanese, so I didn't understand it. Oh, but I will say the spring-themed soundtrack was very nice. As much as I love Donkey Konga 2's, and it's probably my favorite soundtrack in the entire series, I think Donkey Konga 3's set list, at least the Japanese version and what they had there, was much more on character for a Donkey Kong game. Though part of me wonders what the soundtrack for a game like Donkey Konga 3 would have looked like if the game had gotten localized. Nevertheless, I have a huge soft spot for the series, and I still love it to this day. And speaking of franchises I have a soft spot for, 1 year after putting out my 2004 Game of the Year, Sucker Punch came right back with Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves. And let me tell you, while this isn't my absolute favorite in the series, it's definitely the one that I had the most memories with and have probably put the most time into. As a kid, back when I was not actually good at beating games, I used to pop Sly 3 in all the time, load my brother's completed file, and just free roam around the hub worlds. For some reason, they were always just so interestingly designed, and I always really loved going around them and just causing hijinks. And some of Sly's new abilities were so fun to play around with. I loved the feature where Sly could go into disguises. Bentley and Murray were even better to play in this game, and there were a bunch new playable characters that were also really great. And I didn't mind the more linear approach this time around either. I think the story also felt really interesting, even if some of the villains were a little less memorable, outside of Mr. Don Octavio, who was incredible. This recital is over. And it does kind of stink that the clues and bottles and things like that were gone, but otherwise Sly 3 is a game I have an incredible fondness for, and I still greatly love it to this day. Sony, please do something with this franchise, I beg of you. Okay, fine, I'll give you one more licensed game. Why not? It's been this long in the video and I've only talked about a Star Wars game, so let's talk about a licensed game and a franchise I'm much more familiar with. Actually, believe it or not, despite my love of SpongeBob, I didn't really play this game much in my youth. I did own the PC version, which I will say was a genuinely great point-and-click game, but the console version was something I only really knew of because I had rented it at Blockbuster. Hey, I finally mentioned Blockbuster in this series. Sorry, I have an extreme interest in Blockbuster and I can't explain why, so don't ask. Anyway, I eventually got back into Lights Camera Pants back in 2020 because my brother found it at a pretty good price and decided to pounce on it. So I said, sure, I'll give it a chance. In re-experiencing it, I was pleasantly surprised because I was just expecting it to be a Mario Party knockoff, but beyond not being a board game, the minigames actually had a fair bit more depth than I was expecting, and it made this really compelling and fun, and the kind of game I could see being really good for audiences of all ages. I've had a fair bit of multiplayer fun with it over the years, and I think it's one of the more polished and genuinely enjoyable licensed games of its era. I also respect that THQ Studio Australia, may they rest in peace, actually made really great use of the license by even bringing in some really obscure SpongeBob characters. At least at the time. I don't know if the modern episodes have used these characters more, but it was kind of wild to see characters like Squilliam and Bubble Bass and Kevin Sea Cucumber and even Cannonball Jenkins. Respect to them for showing how much they actually cared about SpongeBob. In the grand scheme of SpongeBob games, it's hard to top Battle for Bikini Bottom, and this one doesn't quite get there, but for me, it's honestly a really close second. It's a great game, and I'd love to see it get a reissue of some kind on modern platforms. Doesn't even need to be a full remake, just port the game to modern platforms. I think that could honestly be pretty fun. And last in the cream before the crop, yes, that's right, I'm putting this here. Oh shit, wait a minute, this is the first time in this series that I'm really talking about Dance Dance Revolution. And it's also unfortunately going to be the only time that I'm talking about Dance Dance Revolution. And it's the one they slapped Mario onto. I mean, are you surprised that I enjoyed it? But don't get it twisted. I may be a shy, socially awkward person that barely dances in front of other people, but when I'm in an arcade, I do not hesitate to get my hands, or rather feet, dirty with some DDR. I may have not really owned many of the games, but I loved DDR as a kid, and you had to know that seeing a DDR game with Mario on it was everything I could have wanted at the time. And honestly, the game was hella fun, and still is. Obviously, Mario music is some of the best stuff in gaming, and even the remixes in this game sound great and really unique. It's also awesome to just see how far in the Mario canon they really pulled from, even grabbing music from games like Wrecking Crew and Yoshi's Cookie, along with throwing in some random classical pieces of music as well, which is honestly kind of hilarious. I also really like that they added Mush Mode, which was a kind of extra mode that replaced some arrows with things like Goombas, Koopa Troopas, Bloopers. It was a unique new addition to DDR. Again, the visual design was plenty charming, and I like that this felt like a nice, accessible turn for DDR that made it pretty perfect for newcomers as well. I don't know how easy it'll be to find a copy today, but if you can, I recommend giving it a look. This game's an absolute blast. Kudos to Nintendo for using the GameCube as a platform to just be weird as hell. But speaking of weird as well, we're on to the best list, and like I said, it is just one game. There was one 2005 game that stood above them all and got a 10 out of 10 from me. It is a Nintendo game. It's a very weird Nintendo game, but a great weird Nintendo game. And even though I mentioned that I'm not huge into a lot of handheld games, it is a handheld game that is going to be getting my 2005 Game of the Year award. My favorite game of 2005, I have to give it to WarioWare Touched. How about that? Like I said, a handheld game earning one of my Game of the Year awards. Thank the fact that I absolutely love this franchise. WarioWare is a huge favorite of mine, and WarioWare Touch is a game that I have replayed far too many times. I have a lot of memories with it when I was a kid, as a teenager, as an adult, and to this day, it remains my favorite in the series. Even though it's a very short game like all of the WarioWare games are, it's insanely replayable. And I love how great of a showcase this is of the DS's touchscreen. I feel like it was either this or WarioWare Twisted on the GBA, where WarioWare really became a showcase a system's main gimmick kind of franchise for the longest time. But in this case, I'm very glad that it did that, because the touch-based and microphone-based microgames are some of the best in the franchise to date, and I think this game uses every bit of the DS that it can to make for a very memorable experience. There are a lot of other fun unlockables in the game that are worth exploring as well. The visual style is as wild and over the top as any other game in the series, and I think the writing retains a lot of the trademark humor that makes WarioWare such a compelling series. And in WarioWare tradition, I love the callbacks to classic Nintendo games as well. I've mentioned it before, but 9-volt microgames are always my favorites in any WarioWare game. I just feel like WarioWare is the series where Nintendo really gets to go buck wild, and this game is another example of that, and one of the finest examples of that. It's an amazing game that's by far my favorite in the series, and if you haven't played it yet, I highly recommend giving it a look. Even with what we have today from the franchise, this one is still more than worth going back to. So yeah, that's 2005 in gaming. Really fun year to look back on. A lot of excellent games and some really exciting news throughout the industry. I will warn that 2006 is going to be a little bit slower. The lists themselves are going to be a lot lighter and there's not going to be as many games. But 2006 will still have some excitement to talk about. Just you wait. But until then, this was all just my opinion. What did you think of 2005 as a year in gaming? What were some of your favorite games from the year, some of your most memorable experiences from 2005? What are some games I didn't even mention at all that you really enjoyed? And as for the question that I always ask at the end of the video, I'm not going to do a battle between the PSP and the 360 because that's not the synonymous battle. So I think I'll save a 360 related question for the next video, just because it'll make sense then. And instead I'll ask, since I talked about the PSP in this video, did you guys own a PSP and what were some of your favorite PSP games? I guess I could also ask this question, were you team Nintendo DS or PSP when you were younger? I personally had both, but which one was your favorite? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. And yeah, like I said, the 2006 video will be the next one. But again, I'm going to need a minute before that because you won't see it in the final video, but the raw footage of this video is about 48 minutes right now. And as we get further into this series, the videos are going to get longer and longer because I'm just going to have more games to talk about. So yes, 2006 will be next. It might take a minute, but I hope the video will be fun and I hope you guys will look forward to it all the same. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I will see you in the next video. Peace.